Well, welcome to CRCDS. Today I'm Stephanie Sobe. I'm the Vice President of Academic Life and the Dean of the Faculty, among other things, here at CRCDS. And my colleague, Tom McDade-Clay, who is the VP of Enrollment Services, and I...
Institutional advancement.
Oh, institutional advancement, sorry. Beyond the door is Melissa Morrow with Enrollment Services. Welcome you here this morning on behalf of our President, Dr. Margaret McGall. We are so excited to have you at the fall lectures and at this kickoff event. Tom will tell you a little bit more about our speaker this morning, but I invite you to continue the day with us, to worship with us at 4 for the African American Legacy Lecture, and then stay for the evening's opening lecture with Garth Baker's lecture. So I turn the floor over to the Vice President of Institutional Advancement, Tom McDade-Clay.
Well, good morning. It's wonderful to see you all here, and this, in many ways, is part 2 of a conversation that we began as a school a couple of years ago when we welcomed Colonel Kaiser here to begin to introduce us to this topic. And we were delighted when the opportunity arose for us to have Dr. Brock here. We said, this is great. We really hope it works out scheduling-wise, and it did. So we're delighted to welcome her here this morning today. Reverend Brock is Research Professor of Theology and Culture and founding co-director of the Soul Repair Center at Rita Divinity School. A noted theologian, he has lectured all over the world. As co-founder of the Soul Repair Center, Dr. Brock has become an internationally recognized expert on the emerging study of moral injury and recovery. She is a commissioned minister at the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, and has served in a number of prominent denominational leadership positions, including the General Board and the Administrative Committee, as well as being the first chair of the Common Global Ministries Board of the Christian Church and the United Church of Christ. Her book, co-authored with Rebecca Ann Parker, Saving Paradise, How Christianity Traded Love of this World for Crucifixion and an Empire, was a finalist for an American Academy of Religion Award in Reflective, Constructive Theological Studies, and Publishers Weekly selected it as a best book in religion in 2008. In December of 2008, she and Dr. Gabriella Latini began work on the Truth Commission on Conscience in the War, which in November 2010 recommended extensive public education on moral injury. In response, she and Dr. Latini co-authored Soul Repair, Recovery from Moral Injury After War. We are delighted that you're here, Dr. Brock, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Rita.
Thank you. It's actually an honor to follow Colonel Kaiser here. It says founding co-director, and Herm is the other founding co-director of the Soul Repair Center. He was also the host of the Truth Commission on Conscience and War, which is how we met and started this project together. So it's a pleasure to be with you. It was a gorgeous sunrise this morning. It's wonderful to be where it's cool. Fort Worth, Texas is still highs in the 80s. So for a lot of reasons, I'm happy to be in Rochester, and especially to be with you today. I normally don't get this much time. I usually get like an hour and a half or an hour to present everything I'm going to present to you. That will take a lot longer. So we'll have some time to just sort of chew on things. And I want to give you a little bit of background on myself and how, why this project has possessed me at the end of my career. If you had told me in graduate school, when I was writing in feminist theology, that I would be ending my career working mostly with men and veterans and talking to generals at the Pentagon and Republicans on Capitol Hill, I would have wondered why you were smoking. So people have sort of done a double take, including the right wing of people like the Institute for Religion and Democracy, who have been smearing me since 1993 when the Reimagining conference happened and I wound up on Nightline defending it. They started following me and, you know, doing the usual smear campaign. So they have, I think, been a little bit bollocksed up in how to attack me now. So I love providing conundrums for people. It's a job of a teacher. So thank you for having me here today. I'm going to ask you to do two things. One is not to worry about taking notes, because I have a handout that pretty much summarizes the main points of my PowerPoint, and I'm happy to, we can just copy that and pass that out at the end of the day. So you'll have the main notes from my PowerPoint. And our website, which I'll give you at the end of this PowerPoint, has an enormous list of bibliography of annotated books, essays by year, and you'll notice that the first essay on moral injury was published in 2009, so it's that new a topic. And a whole series of both scholarly essays, and news stories and blogs, and resources for congregations and ministers. So you don't have to worry about getting this all in your head or on a piece of paper today or in your computer. So I invite you not to use your electronic devices. Just, this is a thing they know in education. If you type into a computer, you won't remember it. So just unless it's the only way you can remember things and need to do that. Otherwise, I would ask you not to use any electronic devices. I also want to know if anyone will be bothered if I use a laser pointer this morning. I have to ask because if you've been in combat, that little red dot means you need to duck. So I don't want to trigger anything for people. Okay, thank you. I had a veteran remind me that I should ask because it can disturb some people. That's not to say there won't be things in this PowerPoint you will find disturbing. If you don't, then you're not listening. So let me say a little bit about my own background, about how I got here before I start the talk. When I entered college in 1968, I was on a full tuition scholarship from the state of California, and I thought I was going to be a neurosurgeon. I love science and math, and I was going to go on to medical school with my undergraduate BA in pre-med. That was my declared major. I grew up in a military family. My stepfather, who raised me, was a veteran of World War II and Vietnam. He was a medic, did 2 tours in Vietnam. So I had a personal experience of what it's like to live with a combat soldier. It was not pleasant. He was given electroshock after World War II because he was a POW. And I think he had little memory of that war. And he seemed fine. And then when he went to Vietnam and came home, he was a completely different person. So this work I'm doing now is actually quite personal in my own personal history, but I wouldn't have thought it when I entered college. So I started in pre-med, and the civil rights movement hit my campus 2 months after I got there. As a freshman, I got involved because of my own experience coming to the U.S. in 1956 as a Japanese person and experiencing racism as a Japanese person. And so the civil rights movement just made total sense to me. And so I got involved with it. Then that led to involvement in anti-war work, because that was also the heating up of the Vietnam War, and there were vets on campus organizing anti-war stuff. And non-vets also who didn't want to get drafted. I mean, it was, as any of you who lived through that era know how awful it was in terms of the Vietnam War. So I got involved in the anti-war movement, and then the summer I graduated, Ms. Magazine published its first edition as an insert in the New York Times Magazine. Some of you may remember that. So I entered in that 3-month period between college. In college, what happened was my pre-med major disappeared because the math and science seemed boring compared to what I was doing as extracurricular. And so I was really not doing well in my pre-med major, and some seniors said, take this Old Testament class. It'll be the best and hardest class you take in college. And I couldn't figure out, because I had been a Baptist in high school and argued all the time with my church about creation versus evolution, and I believed in evolution. I just walked away from anything religious. In college, like a lot of people do, So why these seniors were telling me to take Old Testament was totally baffling to me. But it was in the Old Testament class that I encountered the Hebrew prophetic tradition, and I realized, oh, we're not doing anything new. It's been going on for thousands of years. And that was very interesting to me, and Jesus became more interesting to me. So I decided to go to graduate school. So between college, when I graduated with a religion major, and when I entered Claremont Seminary to do an academic master's degree, Ms. Magazine came out, so I entered seminary also a committed feminist, which changed my whole take on the Bible and religion as well. So I was doing that kind of work when the National Conference of Christians and Jews in Los Angeles, which was doing a human relations workshop for high school students every summer after the Watts riots happened because in 1965, because they wanted to deal with the race tensions in Los Angeles at the level of high school kids. So I was asked to be the Protestant chaplain because they didn't have anybody else that could do it. And I was with a group of feminists who started challenging the men in the program for not doing gender as one of the civil rights issues. So I worked in that program over a period of 14 years, every summer. I took a break when I went to Switzerland to Basel for 2 years, where I had a relationship with an immunogeneticist, so I kept my foot inside. And he had a postdoc there for 2 years, so I went with him and studied theology at the University of Basel. So in that 2-year period, I didn't work in the program, but for 14 years, I was in that high school program. And when I came back from Switzerland, I went back into working in it. And by the time I came back from Switzerland, they had integrated not only gender into the human relations work that week, along with race, they had also integrated sexuality and sexual orientation issues. This is in 1976. They had integrated sexuality, gender, and family violence issues. There was nothing written about most of these issues anywhere. Not in seminary literature, not in psychological work, except for the stuff from the Freudians that said people made this stuff up. So I had the profound privilege in those 14 years. Our workshop was emotionally demanding. It asked people to examine their racial biases, their gender biases, their sexuality biases, and raise all these questions about identity at a really formative period of people's lives. And so we sent home anyone that seemed too psychologically unstable to handle that kind of work. So we were not a treatment program, and we were not a program for people who were in trouble. We were a program for idealistic young people who wanted better human relations in the world. That was why they came. And the LA School District, and they weren't necessarily religious, but they came out of the LA School District, which gave them social studies credit. And they also came sometimes from Arizona, San Diego, and other NCCJs that would send groups to this camping program. So these are the kids you would see in high school that looked happy-go-lucky, football players, you know, that people who seemed fine. They seemed fine. And in those week-long, I did it twice a week, 1 week in June and 1 week in August in this program in Southern California, I would hear stories of what adults and parents even did to children that were forms of torture worse than Abu Ghraib. Sexual abuse, physical violence that broke bones and put people in hospitals, emotional neglect, emotional torture, terrorization. It was stunning. And we, as a staff, grappled with these things as best we could because there was no literature. And for a long time there weren't even laws like reporting laws. Eventually we stepped into the hornet's nest of reporting laws because we were professionals and we had to report abuse, which got very complicated in a multicultural context. we had a Korean young woman who wanted to kill herself when we told her we had to report her being molested by her brother. So it was just a tangle of trauma that we did our best. And one of the things we focused on, which I realized at the time was a pretty smart thing to do, but we were just desperate. One of the things we focused on was not trying to treat the trauma, but giving people coping skills for what to do when they left the camp, because we realized that some of them, once they actually talked about it, they were more vulnerable because they never talked about it before. And often that was the case. We were the first place they disclosed it. So we actually would role play with them and talk to them about strategies for how they could deal with these issues when they, as we said, went down the hill. So I learned a lot from that program before I ever read anything on trauma, which I started reading when it's, like Judith Herman and people like that. But it turns out that that was very helpful in my work now. Because the one thing we knew we could do, we couldn't fix anything. We knew that. We only had them for a week. We could try to give them some strength and coping skills, but we knew we weren't going to fix anything. So we knew that the one thing that mattered was we believed them and listened. And we let them talk. And if we saw somebody that looked, I remember a guy in one of my groups who I knew, because we sometimes got this information ahead of time. He had just left juvenile prison for a charge of murder. And he was 16. So he had just come out of prison for murder, and he was 16 years old. And he was Hispanic, so I didn't understand his culture at that point. I still don't think I understand gang culture, but he was in a gang. And he sat in my group all week and said nothing. And his name was Israel. I'll never forget him. His name was Israel. He sat in my group. He wasn't sullen. He didn't have that mood. He was just shut down. He wouldn't talk. Never said a word. And I decided not to press him. And then on the next to the last day at camp when we did the family issues, one of the young, we used peer leaders and staff people to talk about family things that happened to them, which gave permission for people to talk. And one of the peer leaders had talked about how his brother had been murdered in a gang war and what it had done to his mother to lose her son. And he wept. It was devastating. So when we got to our small group, Israel had been crying, I could tell. He just had, his eyes were sort of red and he looked sad. Still didn't say anything. So other people talked about their family issues, and it got near the time to end. And I finally thought, I'm not letting this kid out of here without a chance to say something. And so I looked at him and I said, Israel, you look kind of sad. Would you like to share anything? And he said, no. I just know that if I were that guy's mother, I'd want to kill him. And he said nothing. So I had a clue as to what had happened to him. And so we finished the group, and as he was leaving, I stopped him and I said, Israel, I want to thank you so much for saying what you said today. And I can tell you're feeling a lot of things. I hope you honor those feelings. I think they're part of the goodness in you. And that was all I could think to say to him. But now doing this work, I think that was probably the right thing to say to him. I didn't know it at the time, but sometimes just one crucial intervention of someone who believes in some good part of you makes a huge difference. So that was an experience I had of trauma and learning to listen, which I now think is really crucial for this work on moral injury, because you can't fix it. It's a long recovery process, a lifetime recovery process. Trauma is like that. The other thing that happened to me in this journey was after I had done that, I wrote my doctoral thesis on the perspective of the abused child. That's the Journeys by Heart book. It's my first book. The title doesn't lead you to understand that, but that's really the energy behind that book. Because I sat in a class in ethics, and the professor was doing a lecture on Reinhold Niebuhr's Moral Man and Immoral Society, and his point was that people are more moral in their private loving relationships than they are when they organize in mass crowds, and I thought that guy has no clue. No clue. And that's when I knew I had something to say. That I knew something he didn't know, or didn't admit maybe. But in any case, that launched me on looking at Christian theology from the perspective of someone who's been traumatized and how much of it reinforces trauma. So Journeys by Heart is a disruption of that in Christology. And then later on, because I worked on these issues, and I cared about how social issues impact theology, Susan Thistlethwaite and I worked on prostitution, which meant we also looked at military bases and how the military understands sexuality and women and gender. So that also was good research for later on. And one of the colleagues in this time period that I worked with on her board was Murray Fortune, who was doing clergy sexual abuse and family sexual violence, and founded her organization in 1975, I think. So right around the same time as I was working on these with high school students, she was working on these issues in church context. She is now one of the leading experts on military sexual trauma because of her work. And I wind up working on moral injury. So Marie and I have a similar life trajectory in some ways on this issue. We wound up looking at the military as a major institution where a lot of this stuff is lived out, this trauma is lived out. So that's just a little background on how I got from pre-med to veterans of war. And in between, and this is just to say that I'm not a scientist, but I've worked a lot with scientists. So for 4 years, when I was director of the Bunting Institute that became the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study when we merged with Harvard, I worked with 10 scientists a year. So I worked with 40 top-notch lead researching scientists, and some of them were neuroscientists, and I was beginning to hear at that point about the neuroscience research on MRIs and brain scanning and neuroplasticity and a whole series of issues that are now the hottest thing in biology. And impacting pastoral care, impacting study of religion. So I have some neuroscience, it's about all I know. I have some neuroscience in my PowerPoint because I think it helps us understand the cost of the mind-body split in Western culture. It's a serious cost, and we have to bring those two things back together. It's been a feminist principle for 30 years, but we didn't have the science. We now have the science on why it's important. Why the body matters so very much. So, I'm not going to start with the body, I'm going to start with the soul, or the spirit. So what is it? Every religious tradition has some sense of this invisible, non-tangible, but yet very embodied, real reality in human beings that has a kind of luminosity, has a kind of inspirational quality, has some, it makes us feel good. So what is it? I think if I were to summarize what religious traditions mean when they use the word soul or spirit, they mean empathy and conscience. And conscience, of course, is part of how we relate to other human beings in non-destructive, non-harmful ways. We try to be good is one term for it. We try to maintain deep and committed relationships of love and care because our lives depend on them. That is a non-negotiable in human life. We are actually made for love. And if we don't have it are human. We may have a body and we may look like a human being, but without it, we are so damaged that often an infant without it, well fed and cared for, will die. And the Romanian orphanage story is a case in point about how you can take care of and feed babies, but they don't grow up to be fully human beings. It's called attachment disorder. It's a pretty bland term for the devastating impact of no love. So I think soul or spirit is connected to that capacity in human beings, that every human being is built for love. And love requires us to learn slowly how to relate to other human beings so that they will love us. It's not an unconditional. It's very hard for human beings to love, for example, a severely autistic child who doesn't like to be touched and doesn't look in your eyes, and all the ways that we show love. It can be done. An autistic child can be raised by a loving family, but it's hard. It's not a simple thing. So love is interactive. It's a relational reality, and its primary driver is empathy. So a mother or a caretaker, a father, a grandparent, whoever is the primary caretaker of an infant has to have that capacity for empathy. What does it mean? It means that you can experience, and our brains are actually hardwired for it. There's a genetic defect in people who can't feel empathy. It's actually something that's not right about the brains. But I'll get to that later. But a caretaker, empathy is a very complicated thing. It's actually not simple. It's not that you feel somebody's feelings. That we're hardwired for as a social organism. We can smell the fear in somebody's sweat like that, because that's an environmental thing. An evolutionary thing. If we don't run right away, so our fear reactors are very highly tuned to other people, and our perceptual system is very visual also. We just are very highly tuned to have emotional contagions, as it were. We're almost like one organism sometimes. So you can pick up, I've had this happen as a teacher, you can pick up a shift in the emotional tenor of a room like that. So people start to get angry, you know it, even before your thinking brain registers it, right? But students get angry, so it's okay. I've had this really happen. When my back was turned, I was actually writing on the board and I could tell they were angry. I could just feel the shift in the room. I had to turn around and deal with the anger. So that's just something we can do. Empathy is not that. Empathy is when you pick up on somebody's distress and you know it's not yours. That's what psychologists call boundaries. That you don't confuse somebody else's distress with your own distress. Even if it triggers your own distress, you can tell it's not coming from you. Because that is the little bit of distance between you and the other person that enables you to respond to that distress, usually in an attempt to alleviate it, which is why the caretaker of an infant has to have that capacity. I remember my friend Sharon, she had her first son was a miracle. She thought she couldn't get pregnant, and she and her husband had this son, Zach. And they were so excited, and her husband was all excited, but he worked. She was the main caretaker most of the time, so she knew Zach pretty well. And then her husband would come home to help out, and Zach would be crying, and he would take Zach into the bed and bounce him on the bed. And when he wouldn't stop crying, Dale would say, "Well, he liked it before. Why won't he?" And she said, "Because that's not what's wrong with him. He doesn't want to play. You need to change his diaper." He just didn't have that radar, because it's not something you just you have to be trained to. And you have to know somebody well enough to know when they're in distress, why. So if a mother keeps trying to feed her infant when it's already full and it's crying because its diaper's dirty, that's not good care. And you start to notice I have a friend who was the caretaker for his first child while his wife worked, and he says, I know to this day that Freddie, I am tuned into his emotional moods in a way my wife is not. And the same way that she's tuned into our other children, because then I went to work and she stayed home. He figured that out, that he just didn't have quite that connection to his younger children that he did to his oldest son, because he stayed home every day, all day with Freddie. So those are things that are part of what I think we call solar spirit, that capacity to relate to other human beings in a caring way and to be loved in return, and to not want to violate those relationships by behavior that breaks those bonds. And that's not an infantile thing, it's something we all need till we die, no matter what age we are. So that's what I mean when I talk about soul repair, is that capacity. How do we help people recover or maintain that capacity to be in touch with our own feelings and to feel other people's feelings in a way that's caring and understanding. And that requires both a capacity for our own vulnerability and openness with them. If you don't share your own distress with others, then you don't give them that capacity to help you. So it becomes a one-way thing, and that's not love. That might be caretaking or something, but it's not. But love is really that deep intimacy. So, this is your brain. My friend Bill Gibson at the Canandaigua VA does a talk for us at our conferences, because he's the best teacher of PTSD I know. So everything I know about PTSD I learned from Bill. But when I put this slide up, he said, "Oh man, that is such a cool picture of the brain. Where did you get it?" And I said, "Oh, it's just online. I got it online." But if you can imagine the evolutionary process, our brains have been built from lower animals to higher animals, and our brain systems actually reflect this in terms of the parts. It's like a three-layer cake, and the lowest layer is the earliest and the one we most share with every living organism that has a central nervous system. So they call that lower level sometimes the reptile brain, right? As if that were a bad thing, but actually it's a very important part of our body system because we'd be dead without it. So that lower basic functioning, number one, is the part of your brain that's working right now that you're not even paying any attention to, that's keeping your heart beating, keeping your breakfast moving through your system, and keeping you breathing. It's called the autonomic nervous system. It's all those sort of body functions that your body's just going through all the time that maintains, it's like the little engine in there. That's your reptile brain. And you can, because our brains work this way, they're all connected, all the parts are connected, you can actually impact that part of your brain sometimes in some ways. So the top part of your brain, your thinking brain, like right now, if I asked you, just do this, take a really long, slow, deep breath and let it out as slowly as possible. Just let it ooze that breath, ooze out of your body. It actually calms you down. It actually will affect your blood pressure to do that. They teach people this is how they teach snipers and Olympic marathon, triathlon, who they have to shoot after their breath is really going fast. They teach this breath control because it will calm down your pulse and blood pressure rate. I actually had a vivid demonstration of that one winter when I had a doctor's appointment. There had been an ice storm and it was a really dangerous drive to my doctor's office, and I didn't want to cancel it because I was busy and it was the only time I could go. So I'm driving in my car really feeling like, and I'm pre-hypertensive, I thought I'm going to flunk the blood pressure test. And it was a 20-minute drive. So the entire way to my doctor's office that morning, I just thought, oh, I should just try to calm myself down. And I started taking breaths and going, oh. had to let my breath out really slow. Every breath, I chanted Om, Om. And when I entered my doctor's office, she said, your blood pressure's kind of low. So I passed the test. That's just because it's funny. The breath, when we're upset and nervous and our blood pressure's going up, we're taking slow, shallow, fast breaths. And it's that intake that raises your blood pressure. The outtake lowers it. When you let your breath out, it lowers it. That actually is a different nervous system than the intake part. Isn't that weird? So, but it actually will calm you down. So that brainstem thing is really, really important. And your conscious mind can sometimes have an impact. But what tends to actually act on part 1 more than anything is part 2 of your brain, the feeling, perceiving brain. So everything I've said to you, everything you're seeing, feeling, the air temperature, what you're feeling in your hand, your arm, your skin, all of that is being processed in part 2 of your brain. Because that's the part of your brain that's your main survival brain. It's what's taking in information and responding immediately to whether it's good or bad. That's the main thing. Should you be afraid? So your fear center in that little brown thing, it's actually, there are 2 of them, one on each side. They're called amygdalas or amygdala as a pair. They are just like directly connected to your smell and sight, because that's, if you are walking in the woods and you see the grass rustle, and you don't know what that grass is rustling, if it's just the wind or it's a tiger, and you know, your fear system is going to assume it's a tiger because it's a signal for something that you should be afraid of and run from or do something. So the fear center is usually the most reactive part of our brain. It's like if you've almost been in a car accident, your foot hit that brake before you knew you hit the brake. Because it saw this, your visual said, brake! And then your thinking brain said, I hit the brake. Because, you know, these are electrical pulses, so think how far away your thinking brain is from your fear system as opposed to your sensory apparatus. That's how fast your emotional brain system can respond to stimuli. So that's important because this is how we develop a moral conscience, is we take in information from a time we're about 2 years old. Our brains, we have too much brain power when we're born. We have more neural tissue than we need, and it's not very well organized. So when we're born, our brain gets busy organizing based on repeat patterns that set up what they call pathways. So this is the part of our brain that makes that work. And even our sensory system isn't super finely tuned. You know, they know that infants don't see as well as they do later on as they begin to sort of notice the world around them. So basically, your brain is like any muscle. It develops as you work it. So your feeling brain starts to go to work, and it sorts everything out, starts to develop, your vision gets better, your hearing, all kinds of things happen. But your thinking brain doesn't begin to sort itself out, that's the 3rd level, until you're about 2. As language develops, right? As sort of 2 years old is when you start to maybe say little short sentences, you sort of start to sort out the words and how they mean. So you're hearing a lot of words when you're younger. They're coming through your audio system, and you're watching things and feeling things and picking up on emotions of those around you, including the hormonal systems, like when your mother is nursing you and her endorphins are high and your endorphins learn to be high. So that sets a point in all human beings that skin-on-skin contact with somebody you know and care about releases endorphins. So sex is like that, but just being close to another human being will release those good feelings. This is why love is important through your whole life. That's how you get those good feelings. So those are all things that happen to you and so this thinking brain, when you're about 2, starts to form, and that's when moral conscience begins to form. So you can keep training a 1-year-old not to do things, but until they're about 2 or 3, they don't know why. They can't say why, but they've been trained not to do it. So my friend and 2-year-old grandson spilled red wine on my white jeans one day, and I jumped up and went, ah! And he just stood back and he said, I'm sorry. And his mother went berserk. She said, oh my God, he's never apologized before. I said, well, he just kind of figured out he should. So it was, to me, vivid evidence that about 2 is when this kicks in, and he actually, maybe he meant it, maybe he didn't, but he knew he was supposed to say, I'm sorry when somebody's upset with him. So that's how it begins. And most of us are basically socialized into our moral meaning system through repetition, through ritual behavior. Things get repeated and repeated and repeated, and neural pathways are laid down. So our first set of primary caregivers, whether it's parents, grandparents, an extended family, in my case, I was mostly with my grandparents until I was 5, because both my parents worked. But you learn how to be a moral human being as you are with your primary caretakers. You pick up on their behaviors. And if they aren't good, it's bad for you. It's very bad for you. But one good, loving person in a bad childhood can make all the difference. One good, caring person, a minister, a teacher, can make all the difference. So that's how you become a moral person. Most of us behave all day long in a moral way without even thinking about it. We only start thinking about it when we hit a problem and need to solve it. When there's no good choice and you try to figure out what's the lesser of 2 evils. That's when the moral conscience thinking process really kicks in and becomes important. But for most of the time, we don't shoot people or beat them up because we know that's wrong. And you wouldn't even think of it because it's just not built into your system to relate to people that way. So when people do that, it really is shocking to most people because it's such a violation of a whole body meaning system that they've internalized that's in their whole body system. So often, and this is a word that psychologists use, when a person in an emergency situation suddenly just does the right thing and maybe saves a life or calms the situation, and then somebody asks them, well, why did you do that? They're dumbfounded. They call it dumbfounding because they don't know why. They can't explain it. It's just like, well, why wouldn't you do that? That's how most of us are moral. So this process of becoming a moral person happens through attention and repetition, what I call ritual. Focused attention and repetition. It comes usually with words and stories, which makes it a meaning system in our thinking brain. We begin to think, when we think about it, we think about it in relation to language and story. And stories tend to have emotional power in a way, just saying like moralizing doesn't. That's why we like stories, because they're holistic. They're an art form. And moral reasoning occurs when you hit a problem. So moral reasoning becomes important, like that meaning system and the language becomes important when you don't know what to do, when it's not obvious. And you can change meaning systems, but it has to be an immersion ritual process. You cannot read a book on a new moral system and put it in your body so you're enacting it unconsciously. You actually have to live it. That's why I think when we're talking in the society about racism, and I have very many well-intentioned white friends that fight against racism, go to marches, really think that racism is wrong, but have never in any way had any close contact with anyone but white people. And don't understand their own implicit racist behaviors. The way, I have so many black male friends walking down the street, when a white woman walks by, she pulls her purse closer. And she probably doesn't even think about it. Right? And that is not something you can think your way past. You have to live it. So this means immersing yourself in a different cultural system so that you understand it as part of your own body system. And I actually didn't understand that myself because I did all the civil rights work until I went and taught at a black college for 2 years. And this happened in that 14-year period I was in that high school program. And so I was around and in a context in which I was a minority. I've always been a minority, but it's been in a white context. So now I'm a minority in a black context. And I had plenty of very large black men in my classes on the basketball team who would sometimes be in my face about something. And I would just say, look, you didn't do the homework. That's why you got an F this, midterm or whatever. And we would have arguments in class. We would engage issues. So when I went back to that program, a year after I had been at that college, I flew back to Los Angeles. This was a college in Texas. I was facilitating a large group meeting. Sometimes we had these town hall meetings, we called them, so people could air things. And one of the white kids said something that upset a lot of the black campers, and to the point where one of the guys sitting on this side was going to jump up. He was about to run across from the other guy, and I didn't think about it. I just stepped right in front of him, and I looked up in his face, and I said, I didn't call on you, so sit down. You'll get your turn. And several people said, he looked like you hit him. He was so shocked that you did that. And I thought, oh. And I probably a year before, I don't know what I would have done, but I don't think I would have just automatically just stepped in front of him and said, look, I didn't call on you. And he respected my authority and sat down and got his turn to speak. So I didn't even notice the change in my behavior. That's how unconscious it is, right? So this body system has to absorb it. You can't think your way to moral behavior if you're changing systems. And that's why white privilege works so well. Or gender privilege, or sexuality privilege. These forms of privilege work because they're so hard to purge from our body systems. But it is possible to change. It just takes a long time and a committed effort. It's not a simple thing to change. And sometimes when you transition from one system to the other, you can hit a major conflict. Okay, so just an example of that. This is a group of surgeons training on a dummy. Now, it is not a normal thing to cut into human bodies. We have such a strong code about personal, private integrity, body integrity, that every culture has a zone. And it's different for every culture how big that zone is, but it's a private space you do not invade. And if you're from a culture like Japan, where that zone is about bowing distance apart, I had a president one time at a school who I just didn't like because he had this habit when he shook your hand of pulling you into him to talk, like in this confidential way. And it was like such a violation of my sense of personal space. And I didn't even know why I didn't like him. I finally figured it out. It's that he invaded my personal space every time I talked to him. Right? So it's different for every culture, and we attach a moral value to it. And the violation of it, we often think badly of a person who violates it. So think about what it must be like to learn to walk in and cut a body. Now, if you think the book of Leviticus is complicated for what a priest has to do to go into the temple, think about what a surgeon has to learn to do. Over and over until it's completely ritualized. The cleansing, right? Cleansing of things. Then you take off your ordinary clothes. You have to put on a uniform, right? A garb. And then there's a ritually set up space with all the instruments needed by a team of people that has to know what they're doing. And you walk in to this team of people who've also gone through their own purification processes. Now, there was a surgeon at Johns Hopkins that went to Africa to learn a special technique for babies that where they have fluid on the brain, They were putting in shunts that had to be replaced. It was really expensive, and in Africa they just figured out how to create a way for it to drain. So he was going to go learn it. Well, when he got there, he discovered that the surgical team, after they got all prepared, patient was anesthetized. Then this one you hurry up because they're under, and they didn't go right into it. They stopped and prayed. And he said sometimes a surgeon prayed, sometimes a nurse prayed, sometimes the anesthetist, but somebody would pray for the patient, the family, the hands of the doctor, the caregiver, long prayer. That's how they started surgery. So that's clearly, more clearly, I think, what we would think of as ritual. But a surgeon has to enter a surgical space in a highly ritualized, confined way. It becomes what we would call liminal space. It's outside of ordinary morality, outside the moral code and cultural system. And there are a lot of civilian occupations like this. This is just nurses. They also wear a uniform. They're also cleansing ritual. It's highly ritualized. And they have to learn the behavior so clearly that they don't have to think about it when they do it. Because you don't want your surgeon thinking about everything they have to do. You want them to be able to make that cut exactly because they've done it. So this is why one time I was reading, sometimes you want a young doctor when you're getting a diagnosis because they're up on the latest science for medical school, but you want an old surgeon. You want somebody who's done it all. And my cataract surgeon was in his 60s, and my eyes are fine. That's what I was picking, my cataract surgeon. I picked a guy who'd done a lot of that. So that this ritual changing is really, really important. But people come into these changes. People come into these shifts in moral meaning systems. You can have it happen in childhood. You can have it happen in adolescence. I switched completely at age 6 from Japanese Buddhist culture to U.S. military. People can do it, and most people do it in college. But whatever they do, they carry what happened to them before. It's not like it disappears. Changing ritual systems is not brainwashing. It's just laying down new neural pathways, and the others may atrophy a little or just get smaller from disuse, but they're still in there. So this is just the legacy of trauma in U.S. society. These are mid-90s or late 90s statistics from the CDC and Kaiser, but I think they're probably pretty typical of what kind of trauma people carry through life from childhood on. So you're looking at about a third of the population, 1 in 3. That means 1 in 3 people in this room are carrying this forward. So 80% of 21-year-olds who reported childhood abuse met the criteria for at least one psychological disorder. And I'm going to say something about that because I think most of them are related to PTSD. The other thing about these numbers is that if you report 6 forms of these, so if you have had several people who abused you or sexually abused you, emotionally, if you report about 6 of these in childhood, your life expectancy is 20 years younger. That's the impact of trauma on the body. 20 years lost of life. So PTSD, I'm just going to say a little about because it's so related to also moral injury, especially in survivors of that kind of abuse and in combat veterans. And it's often intertwined, so it's very complicated. They're not the same thing, but they're often intertwined. So you can see that, as I said, the brain responds to stimuli, what our attention tells our brain to pay attention to. So what you're not using, your brain atrophies. So this is what they call a regular brain. These are 2 Iraq vet brains. So in this case, your frontal cortex is kind of tight up against your skull because it's fully formed and functioning. Your midbrain is reacting normally to stimuli around you, normally as in appropriate to what it is. And then your brainstem area is down here. So this PTSD brain, you can see the frontal cortex, the thinking brain, has lost density, it's lost tissue. It will do that. Because PTSD makes it hard to think. It actually does. So your midbrain, your fear center especially, but other parts of your brain that handle terror, get overworked. And it happens because your amygdala flares up, and then it's overstimulated, and for some reason it malfunctions. The relationship between your fear center and your thinking brain can't calm you down. So what happens is you develop symptoms of fear that just won't go away. And then those symptoms of your overactive fear brain keeps working, it keeps growing. So one of the most important things in the way therapy treats PTSD is to try to calm people down. There's a major piece in just getting a handle on the symptoms. So what are some of the symptoms? Hypervigilance. That's what PTSD feels like. So you get hypervigilant. This is from, by the way, Bill Gibson's PowerPoint. He gave it to me, so I borrowed some of the slides. I'll give him credit. So hypervigilance, you just, it's the way some vets can't go to bed at night until they, as they say, they scan the perimeter. They go out and they check all the locks and doors and the yards and everything, and they close all the windows and make sure everything's shut down tight. So hypervigilance. It's it's like nobody's broken into that neighborhood in 20 years, but they have to make sure they're safe. It's hypervigilance. Or they may be sitting in a room, and the whole time they're sitting in, they're scanning. They're scanning the room for danger. They're looking for anything that might be scary. So, no, most of us don't sit in a room and do that. Most of us sit in a room and we sort of calm down and we just watch. But hypervigilance means you can't calm down. You don't trust your surroundings. You don't trust other people. You think everybody in the room might have a gun. Somebody might shoot. Every backpack might have a bomb in it. And there are all these ways in which the world that you used to trust can no longer be trusted. So there's a high mistrust factor. Fear has a lot of anger, because if you have to fight, that's aggression. That's an act of aggression. So there's a lot of anger in PTSD, and often somebody can erupt into sort of irrational violence. There's a scene from the film American Sniper when a dog is playing with his kid in the backyard barbecue, and he runs in and looks like he's going to kill the dog. Completely, inappropriate, but he was great, that dog, for messing with his boy. Jumpiness, just easy startle reflex. Insomnia is huge. I know so many veterans who can't sleep through the night, sometimes only sleep 2 hours. Because if your fear center is in high alert all the time, it's hard to calm down enough to really go into a deep sleep. So often they will drink to fall asleep. That's the only way they can fall asleep. So insomnia is huge because the only way your thinking brain is restored is through deep sleep. That's really important. Sleep is an amazing healer of the brain. They now know that there are little janitor cells that go into your brain while you're sleeping, and they clear out all the free radicals and things that you accumulate. It's like your engine, it's all that exhaust fumes in your brain from your engine, your brain working all day, and the little janitors go in there and clear it all out while you're sleeping. And if you don't sleep well, they can't clear it. Your brain gets clogged from all of the refuse that's left in the trash cans. So sleep is really important. You can also have just palpitations. These are all parts of a panic attack. Palpitations, shortness of breath, sweating, or a full-blown panic attack where you just have to get out of a space and you can't be there, or you just start shooting because you're panicking or whatever, but a panic attack can happen. And then there are these issues around memory, because it's like you remember certain things that happen and you just can't make them go away. They just keep coming up for you. So you have trouble remembering new things because these other things are interfering. You can't concentrate. This is a big issue for vets on the GI Bill in colleges. It's like it's hard for them to learn, and faculty don't understand this. They just think they're lazy or they just can't get the work done, but they're having trouble concentrating. It's a big issue. And you're flooded with, your body is full of these things that a French psychiatrist in the 18th century called memory parasites. He noticed this. People who have PTSD, he wouldn't have known to call it PTSD, but he knows that his patients would sometimes have flashbacks or nightmares where they couldn't actually consciously remember anything, but they would relive an episode. This is what sometimes people call split personality. Sometimes a person is a different personality because they're in a whole other reality. That's like a living nightmare, a flashback. And I love the term memory parasites because it's not that if you can't remember, it doesn't mean they're not in your body system, in your brain. It might even be in your lower body. You might remember because of something physical. So it might be stored in somewhere in your muscle tissue, but they come up like a parasite when you don't want them. They're not under your control. So those are all ways that PTSD acts, and there are also a lot of what's called the psychiatric disorders that afflict people with childhood trauma. So they might be schizophrenic because they're out of touch with reality, or they might be agoraphobic. A lot of phobias are related to our PTSD phobias. So I think that it's really important when you're working with people who have trauma to attend to some of these symptoms. And there are treatments for them, yes.
In your list of symptoms, I'm wondering, okay, let me start with a story. My brother has PTSD and frequently acts in his sleep. Before his guns were taken away, he used to get up and in his sleep, take apart his gun, put it back together. Take apart his gun, put it back together. There were times when he would wake up with his hands around his wife's neck because he thought he was in his brain reliving something. Do they have a word for that, or is it just kind of
it's part of nightmares. It's part of what happens in your sleep. He's probably dreaming about being in some situation in which cleaning his gun made him feel safer, right? Or that he's dreaming that somebody is attacking him, and so he's going to defend himself. Those are actually common things. Carl Merlantis, in his book, What It's Like to Go to War, said he thought he was fine for 10 years. And then in his 10th year, he got slammed with PTSD and moral injury in a serious way. But it's clear from how he describes that first 10 years that his thinking brain was able to repress some of that PTSD. But he remembers an instance where he was taking a nap. I think it's in his book. He was taking a nap on a couch, and the next thing he knew, he had his arms around his son's neck. Right, because his son had tried to wake him up. So those are actually really common kinds of PTSD. And there's a wonderful book by Bessel van der Kolk, K-O-L-K, that'll be in your reference list, but anyway, called The Body Keeps the Score. And he's an expert. He runs a trauma center in Massachusetts. He used to be at the teaching hospital for Harvard Medical School. He's a psychiatrist who is a non-ideological psychiatrist. He doesn't have a pat theory that he thinks works for everybody. So he's tried a whole series of different kinds of treatments for trauma. His colleague was my friend Judith Herman, who wrote the book Trauma and Recovery. So the two of them have worked together on what's called complex PTSD, which is what afflicts people who have this from childhood. And it's a wonderful resource for various kinds of treatments he's tried that work for people that have nothing to do with drugs. He's very opposed to the use of drugs because he thinks it creates a medical model of dependency and the person's only okay as long as they take the drugs. So he's trying other treatments, and he's tried dance, he's tried theater, he's tried EMDR, the eye movement therapy, he's tried meditation, he does yoga himself for his own issues. it's a great resource for, and it's got this reference section at the end that's awesome. If you are a researcher, it's awesome. That's one book I recommend if you know anybody with PTSD. It's just helpful in understanding what they're going through and things that you might do for them to help them calm down.
Did you say that name again?
Bessel, B-E-S-S-E-L, and then Vander, he's Dutch, Vander, and then K-O-L-K, like in yolk with a K. Yeah.
What's that new book that came out this fall? Is that the one?
It's 2014, I think. Yeah, it's kind of a summary of his whole career, and it's really fabulous. Yeah, I mean, if you're a researcher, he has plenty of juried articles about this stuff, so it's based on pretty solid research, but since I'm not a researcher and I just want the goods. That book was great. I've read it. I've got it as an audiobook, and it was so good I got the paper version for the reference section, but I've actually listened to it twice. It's fabulous. That's how I do a lot of my reading is audiobooks, by the way. Makes me remember better. So now we're cutting to the chase with the issue, and I'm just going to do a little bit here, and then we'll take a break, and I'll finish this morning with a long discussion of what moral injury is. And then this afternoon, I'll talk more about what the recovery process looks like and what are things that help. So military training is a major shift in a moral code system, and the military has its own very tightly constructed culture. And what's amazing to me is that the military can take an ordinary 18 to 25-year-old, and that age range is critical for neural formation because the moral formation of your brain ends at about 27 or 8. So these are college is very formative, graduate school and college are very formative years for reshaping that thinking brain system. And the military recruit average age is that range also. They take somebody's son or daughter, and in 8 to 12 weeks, they have them as part of a competent fighting unit. 8 to 12 weeks. It's actually an incredibly short period of time. But they do it the way you would train an Olympic athlete. They do it the way you would train a monk. They do it by creating a total environment that they cannot escape and feeding them, controlling what they eat, when they eat, how they eat, how they walk, when they sleep and how.
When they go to the bathroom.
Yes. Yeah, you have to ask. And what you wear and what you look like. So it's called a total environment. So that's what sociologists call it. There are a number of these kind of total environments. Prison is another one. Where everything in your life is controlled and repeated ritually over and over and over until you don't have to think about it. So you can see it when you see the first time a group of new recruits in a squad has to march and chant, and and when and 8 weeks later when they graduate, they are now all marching in, and it's done in a group system. So, and this is also what anybody who teaches spiritual practices knows: doing it in a group makes it easier. Absolutely. Same with dancing. Same with anything that you have to train to that's unfamiliar to you. When you're with a whole group of people learning to do it together, there's some kind of organism communication process that even your heart rates and your body systems start to behave similarly. Choirs know this. That it's a ritual. It's a highly ritualized training process, and it's very effective. Because it's a high penalty for failure. Because most times your entire unit pays if you fail. Right? So they may berate you individually and humiliate you, but they also may punish the entire unit. So there's a high motivational factor for succeeding beyond being punished or humiliated, which is that you're also taught a moral code about why this is life or death if you do things well. So there's a strong moral code that's taught with the military system. It has to do with excellence at the work you do, care for other people, being of service to others, being willing to die for someone else, that your relationships are that close with people that, as everybody I've talked to says, people don't die for their country, they die for the guy on either side of them. That's how close those relationships are. They're taught integrity, honesty, obedience to authority. There's a whole moral code and the rules of engagement for combat. So they are taught to shoot under certain conditions, and they're in World War II, when the military, when this general did a study, S.L.A. Marshall did a study, he discovered that 25% of the soldiers in World War II actually ever shot to kill the enemy. I mean, 75% of them didn't, and the Army realized they had a problem. So they started teaching what they call reflexive fire training, where people are taught to shoot automatically on command or in circumstances. Instead of now shooting at targets, they shoot at pop-up simulations where they've got somebody on the top of a building and a dog running across the street, and all these things happening. You have to figure out where to shoot. They train them on urban warfare, and they train them to shoot reflexively, because if you think about it, you're going to be dead. So they call it reflexive fire training, and by Vietnam they had about a 90 to 95% rate, and that they maintained that since. So we have a much more effective lethal military, because they figured out how to ritualize and train as a reflex the shooting response. But it doesn't mean people are taught to shoot indiscriminately. There are rules, and everybody that goes into combat carries the rules of engagement in their breast pocket. They're based on the Geneva Conventions, which means you don't shoot civilians, you don't shoot non-combatants, you shoot them because you have the authority to do so under certain conditions. As somebody said, I think it was a vet I was talking to, if they didn't do that, you would just be sending in a lethal mob. So an army is not a lethal mob. An army is a discipline unit. That doesn't mean they don't break those rules, but they're taught those rules. Yeah.
Well, I was in boot camp in '63. When did the rules of engagement come into effect? And I remember learning the spirit of the bayonet was to kill. And you yell that all day long, you know.
Yeah, they still do that. They all kill, 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 kill without mercy and those kinds of things. But they're also taught the rules, and they do carry them in their pocket.
When did that begin?
I have no idea.
I don't remember having that in boot camp, '63.
Yeah, no, I don't know when that began, but I also know the reflexive fire training also began after.
Later.
That. Yeah, It's also the case that in 1975 they eliminated the all-women units.
Yeah.
And so after 1975, women were integrated into the regular military, and in 1993 they were actually integrated into combat units and non-combat roles, so they deployed also. So lots of changes have happened, including now the Army Rangers have graduated to, which, has its own ambiguities. Yes?
We used to have, when I came back from Vietnam, we used to have discussions. My brother was a reservist and a chaplain for some years, but he'd never been out of the country. And he would always bring up the code of military combat. That's bullshit. I said, I was in a Marine Corps unit. We didn't pay any attention to that. As a unit, as a maneuver battalion, really.
Yeah.
And that's one of the issues that a lot of us brought back was what we remembered that we did under commanders.
Yeah, we'll get to it. We'll get to it.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, that's the moral injury piece. Yeah. So I'm just trying to explain how you can shift from being a civilian to being a member of the military and how that happens, because it has consequences. It's not like the 18 years of your life before you enter the military just disappear. And some people find the basic training itself too traumatizing. They actually experience moral injury in the basic training. I talked to a woman in the Navy who just wanted the Navy to pay for her degree as a psychiatrist, and she joined up, and she said she was really disturbed by the basics. She was shocked. She didn't really realize that the women went through all the same training of shooting and stuff. If you went in before 1975, you basically learned to put a gun together and you've got to shoot it once or twice, but mostly they focused on comportment and manners and dress. That's what a woman in the Marine Corps before 1975 told me. She said, oh, we just shot the gun once and then they told us how to put on makeup and things like that. That is like totally off the table. Women get their hair, their hair cut. All that happens. So I don't think their heads are shaved, but their hair gets cut. So
Hair gets cut in 82, yeah.
yeah, pretty short.
Yes, we did.
Yeah. So it's very different, and a lot has changed. But that doesn't mean all of these changes now. Those two women that went through the Army Rangers and however many men that made it through, which is also a small percentage of those who tried out, they are trained in a way. The special ops units are trained even longer, often for up to a year. EODs get about 9 months of training to take apart bombs. That person that comes out of that training is highly competent and mostly well-trained, but they don't leave those first 18 years behind. That's still in them. And how much that is in them has something to do with how the military training and the experience of being in the military impacts them. So we know that if you had trauma as a child, if you have had PTSD, and often a lot of adults have PTSD and don't know they have it. My friend Rebecca Parker was sexually abused at age 4 and didn't know she had it until she went to a therapist at 36. She just thought she was spiritual and mystical because she dissociated sometimes, right? A lot of people, that's a common experience. And I think people often come to seminary because they think they're mystical and they discover, no, it's trauma. That's what happened to her. Anyway, if you have had PTSD, especially if it's untreated, you are more susceptible to it again because your brain is already somewhat injured. So those are all factors in how military experience happens. And the difficulty of all of this, and this is a part of the political difficulty of it, is that, and it's less so now, but the VA used to say, well, you didn't come right away and you got this PTSD later, or you have this severe case because you had a pre-existing condition. And the military will absolve themselves of responsibility rather than deal with who they have. Right? So this has been part of the struggle with people getting adequate help and treatment. And the VA did decide, I think it was in 2009, to reopen VA services for any veteran from Vietnam that had a delayed PTSD diagnosis. They just said, come, we'll take care of you. They also admitted people who were trying to get help with Agent Orange, the exposure to Agent Orange. So the VA's actually done better, but that means they also have a massive new caseload to deal with without a lot of new funding. So there's all these complicated things around what happens to you when you go through the military experience based on your prior history. And that's just one of the things sitting in the room in terms of these trauma issues. Yeah?
Can I just say, too, you can spend up to a year, 18 months training to go into combat. You can be out of the combat zone and back on your home block within 24 hours. And so you have built up to the combat, but there is no build down.
We're working on that. We have been talking to the Joint Chiefs about this. We are working on that.
We're with the Veterans Crisis Line.
Okay, well, I'll tell you about what we're working on later on. But so here are some of the numbers on rates of diagnosis of PTSD. These are the pretty much estimate on diagnosed cases, because you can't do numbers if you can't find it. That's also why I am suspicious of the childhood trauma numbers, because I know plenty of adult women that didn't realize in their 50s and 60s that they've been sexually abused. My friend Rebecca realized at age 36. She didn't remember, because PTSD is loss of memory, right? So her memory came back. She had a good therapist. It took 6 years for her to retrieve that memory, but she got it back. She's much better because she had a good therapist. But we used the eye movement, the EMDR. That's what helped her. So these are the numbers. I think they're low. I think they're probably higher than that, but those are the official numbers. This is also from Bill Gibson. So you can see this is not a small problem. And I think that we're also, I think war just does these things. What I want to say is none of this is because there's something wrong with people. These are normal responses to terrorizing and difficult conditions. PTSD is how your body protects you. The reason you lose your memory of a terrorizing incident, the reason people often, this is also in terms of the legal profession, a difficult problem, is that if you went through something terrorizing like rape, which is almost 100% inducer of PTSD, a gunfire, I mean, all these really earthquake, if you went through a terrorizing condition, you probably won't be able to remember it very well, so you make a bad eyewitness, and you may change your story several times because you can't sort it out. And if a rape victim changes her story even once, she's discredited. Well, it didn't really happen. So that is part of the problem with fear and the terrorizing conditions of PTSD is you lose your memory. Why does this happen? It's because, let me back up to that brain diagram because it's really, really important how it happens. See a little green snake there in your brain? It's called a hippocampus. And right here, sorry. It's a hippocampus, and then you have this processing system that distributes, but the hippocampus is especially important in this, distributes all this input from your senses and stores it in all the parts of your brain you need to retrieve it when your thinking brain says, oh yes, I remember yesterday I went shopping and I think I remember I bought a loaf of bread. That is a complicated thing to remember because your brain has to, it has to remember you went to the market and that all this sensory input is stored in different places and it has to be organized into a memory. So that's important. What happens when you're having an intense moment of fear is that this thing shoots your body full of stress hormones and it shuts down your memory functions. Your hippocampus will shrink. This is true in Alzheimer's patients. The hippocampus is tiny. You're not processing memory. It shrinks because the last thing you need to have happen when you're staring at a set of red lights in front of your windshield and you're like too close and you know you're going to hit the car in front of you and you step on that brake, the last thing you need to have is all your memories coming into your brain. You need to be totally focused in a sensory way on exactly what's in front of you and the emergency at hand in the present moment. So your memory functions shut down. Doesn't mean it isn't stored somewhere as a memory parasite. It just means that the normal memory functions aren't happening for you. So the little things that slot, not happening. Just coming in as a big parasite, sort of glomming into your brain somewhere, but it's not processable as memory until that little parasite is broken open and the pieces can be processed. And that's what therapy can do, in like the eye movement therapy and other forms of memory retrieval. I've talked to a Buddhist monk who uses what he calls trigger release exercise, trauma release exercises, in which he has people's body, their tenseness in their bodies, he can get them to start to remember why that part of their body tenses up. So something has to release those little memory parasites. But it's hard because your body puts them away so you can function. It's a way your body protects you. It's a normal thing. So PTSD And then PTSD, when it becomes a disorder, is when the symptoms interfere with your life and you can't control them and they're extreme. But a lot of us have mild PTSD or post-traumatic stress without the disorder attached to it. We have it when we're in a car accident or in some really terrorizing condition. We just are like a little confused about what happened. We can't remember very well. We may have nightmares for a while. But most of us can handle those okay, and they slowly sort of recede as our thinking brain takes back over and begins to be able to calm us down. But if you have a lot of these memories of parasites stuck in your brain system somewhere, eventually, it's your body protecting you, but eventually, if they're not going to plague you your whole life, you have to figure out how to release them and unpack them and get a conscious memory back. That is really an important part of the process of getting well from PTSD. So I want to just leave you. We're going to go to a break because you've been sitting a long time. We're going to go to a break. I want to just leave you with that thought. This is normal. There's nothing crazy or wrong with people who have this response to a terrorizing condition. But it is an affliction. It is a form of suffering. It's just like when you get shot in the leg. Your leg getting shot, bleeding, and hurting is a normal response to getting shot in the leg. But it is an affliction, and it needs help. So let's take a 15-minute break and come back. And you can think about all this.